Dr. Jason Clay studied at Harvard and the London School of Economics before receiving his PhD at my alma mater, Cornell University, in 1979. Over the course of his career, he has run a family farm, taught at Harvard and Yale, worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and spent more than 25 years working with human rights and environmental organizations. He's authored more than 250 articles, given over 500 invited lectures, and authored 15 books, including comprehensive studies such as World Agriculture and Environment, published in 2004. As the World Wildlife Fund's Senior Vice President for Market Transformation, Dr. Clay currently directs the organization's work with the private sector to improve their environmental practices, particularly through innovative ingredient sourcing, mitigation of carbon emissions, and improved means for water management. He also works with industries to develop credible, science-based global standards as means to measure performance. Dr. Clay has co-convened multi-stakeholder groups to identify and reduce the social and environmental impacts of salmon, soy, sugarcane, cotton, and palm oil production. From 1999 to 2003, he co-directed a global consortium that included the World Bank and the United Nations to help reduce the environmental and social impacts of shrimp aquaculture. Looking at Dr. Clay's record, it is no leap to say that he is a true mover and shaker for the good on a global scale. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Clay to Oregon State University.
Good evening. I was asked by somebody earlier today why I came out to OSU to give this talk, and I said it was because, in fact, the tagline for the series, Living on a Finite Planet, is something that we use all the time to talk about the work that we do. But I just heard another comment which is also interesting, and that is food for thought. When I was earlier in my career, not quite that early, but earlier in my career, I was doing research on the Ethiopian famine and was perplexed why all of the aid agencies weren't really trying to figure out what was causing the famine before they were rushing in billions of dollars, or at least as they were rushing in billions of dollars to figure out how to feed people. So we ran an ad in the Boston Globe called Food for Thought and explained why we needed to know what the problem we were trying to fix before we simply sent more money in that could actually do more harm than good. The ad cost $3,500 to place. We raised about $8,000 to do it. We funded the research on that, and we influenced $2 billion that went to Ethiopia over the next 2 or 3 years. We have to understand the problems that we're trying to solve on this planet if we're going to have a hope in hell of actually doing something. I grew up on a farm in Missouri, northern Missouri, next to Iowa, which many people are surprised when I say if you scan across the country, it's actually north of New York City, because most people think of Missouri as a southern state. We had a saying that went something like this: if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So the question is, where are we going as a planet, as a people, as biodiversity, etc., and how are we going to get there? We can't really escape the basic math of the issue. Population times consumption has got to have a relationship to the planet, and preferably it's going to be a good one. But in point of fact, today it's not equal. We're living beyond the carrying capacity of this planet. We've been publishing what we call the Living Planet Index since the early 1980s. We bring it out every 2 years. It's peer-reviewed methodology, and it's probably the most credible source of trying to figure out where we stand in terms of sustainability, how we're using resources, whether they're beyond replacement capacity or not, etc. And what this index showed is that by the late 1980s, we had actually surpassed the carrying capacity of the planet. And every year we've added a little bit more consumption, and every year we've gotten a little further from where we're trying to get. Today, we're at about 1.25, 1.3 planets. To put that in more graphic terms, on September 25th, we passed the sustainability limit of the planet this year. And next year, it will be on September 21st, and the year after that on September 15th, and the year, etc. So not only do we have to figure out how to live within the confines of the planet, we also have to figure out how to restore the planet. Because when you're pulling down the principal instead of living off the interest, you've got to figure out how to make amends at some point. That's the challenge. So we need to use less, and we need to produce more from this less that we're using. In fact, we've got to really question the consumption that's going on the planet. And some of us are more guilty of that than others. We're not all equal on the planet. Population is clearly an issue. Consumption is also an issue. Most audiences where I speak, every American in the audience will say, well, it's really a population question. We've got to put population back on the table. Population needs to be front and center. The average American consumes 43 times more than the average African in their lifetime. The issue is not just population, it's also consumption. The average cat in Europe consumes more in its lifetime than the average African. The issue is about consumption and lifestyles. It's also about population. But we can't simply point one finger one way and ignore what we're doing ourselves. So it comes down to a fairly simple question. Should consumers have a choice about sustainable products? We don't think they should. We don't think you should be able to buy unsustainable products. We live on a finite planet. Everything needs to be sustainable. If that's our goal, the question becomes, how do we get there? How do we change the lifestyles that are making a choice about sustainability, making a competitive advantage about sustainability? We're all on the same planet. We've got to learn how to manage it. And we need to learn how to manage it as a whole planet, not as the United States, not as Europe, not as South Africa, and not as Coke, or not as Pepsi, or not as Cadbury Schweppes. We're all in this together. Sustainability is a pre-competitive issue. In fact, we think we ought to start seeing collusion around sustainability. All products in the future depend on having natural resources available to use. If we don't begin to address those kinds of issues now, who's going to? When are they? How far do we have to get down the path where we have to regenerate the earth before we're going to see that this is not a sustainable path we're on? So we consider ourselves at World Wildlife Fund a science-based organization. We also consider ourselves, while we're one of the biggest environmental organizations globally, we have finite resources. We can't work on everything. We have to make strategic choices. How we've gone about making our choices is deciding which are the most important places on the planet. And here are 5 of the 35 that we've decided are the most important from the point of view of biodiversity, ecosystem services, the kind of assemblage of species around specific places. Once we identified those 35 places, and believe me, there would have been more if we thought we could work on more, but our budget globally is about $500 million a year. You throw all the environmental groups together, the budgets are probably less than $2 billion a year. That is 20% of what Coke spends on advertising every year. If you look at what the forces are that are getting their message out, it's clear that we're not going to compete in those airways in a head-to-head way. We need to change the way Coke communicates with consumers about sustainability, or the way Cargill does, or the way ADM brings you the Sunday morning talk shows. So the next thing we did was, of those 35 places, what are the most important threats to them? And it's almost always about food. food and fiber, or food that is now being used to make biofuels. We identified a whole range of crops, and we looked at them from the point of view of how much carbon or greenhouse gas they have, how much water they take, who all's working on them, what the market share is, what the caloric share of the global diet is, how much consumption is expanding, how much production is expanding into places we care about. And we identified 15 commodities globally that are the most significant and having the most significant impact on the places we care about. And then we begin to track each of those commodities back to the companies that buy it. We came to a very interesting conclusion. 300 to 500 companies touch 70 to 80% of the trade of each of those 15 commodities. But when you actually dig deeper and start putting lists of companies together by palm oil, by soy, by sugar, by cotton, by all these different commodities, you begin to see the same names start showing up in different places. And what we found is that actually 100 companies, 100 global companies touch 25% of all 15 of the commodities that are the most important. So here we've gone from potentially working with 6.7 billion consumers to working with 1.5 billion producers, to actually realizing that if we can change how 100 companies buy the products they use to make products, we can have an impact on this planet, because that 25% of demand pulls 40% of production. That means that the demand created by those companies, which is 25% of the global market, will cause producers to produce against any standards those companies begin to buy their products against, and that will pull 40% of production trying to compete to sell into those markets. Put that in context. The global organic movement, after 40 years, has 0.7 of 1% of the world market. This is a different approach. We're trying to figure out how to shift the middle of the curve, not how to take the best producers or what somebody has deemed as the far side of the bell curve. We're trying to shift the whole curve. Tonight I'm going to talk a lot about agriculture and ranching, because agriculture and ranching has more of an impact on the planet than any other human activity, in fact, than nearly all other human activities combined. Today, we use about 30% of the surface area of the planet, but if you take out rivers and streams and lakes, deserts, uninhabitable areas, we're up to 55, latest studies show maybe even 58% of the planet. 12% of the planet, terrestrial planet, is used for parks these days. We're not going to increase that very much. We've got about 30% of the planet that's left. That's natural habitat. That's grasslands, forest, wetlands, etc. For the last 40 years, we've been converting much of that land. For the last 40 years, we've averaged about 0.4 of 1% a year, bringing new land into production to feed more people, to consume more things. But the last 10 years, that conversion rate has been about 0.6 of 1%. If you do the math, over the next 40 years, by the time we get to 2050, 24% of that final 30% will have been converted to use for agriculture. Simply put, we will not have biodiversity on this planet if we have business as usual continue. We have got to freeze the footprint of agriculture. We have got to say this and no more, and produce twice as much on what we're doing. So we have to intensify it. It's not a question simply of consuming less. We're not going to consume less and get our way out of this with more people coming on the planet, and with the fact with whole populations that need to consume more than they do today. Now, in this same graph, you see where we stand in terms of the footprint of agriculture and ranching. It's both, it's not just the one. In that last 100 and 150 years, we've lost half the topsoil on the planet. That's one of the things we have to restore. In fact, most farmers on the planet lose more topsoil than they create every year. We are mining the planet to produce food at this point in time. And it's not just about soil, it's also about water. This map shows areas of water scarcity prior to the age of biofuels. This is from 2004, but also prior to significant impacts of climate change. This map's going to get redder as we go forward, and the map is also going to get a lot more variable. There's a lot of implications of climate change related to water that we haven't begun to think about. So if you're a farmer and you have a drought one year and you're flooded out the next year, what bank is going to lend to you for a third year in a row after 2 years of failure? And if you don't get credit, what does that actually do to global production? What does it do to calories that are being produced? What does it do to food security? What does it do to the security of states that are in power in those countries where there's a lot of starvation going on? Last year, in just that little period of the August financial meltdown, 4% of Brazilian agricultural land was not planted because there was no money to put the crops in. That will have a rippling effect on crop prices over the next year, because Brazil is what is determining global prices for a dozen different crops around the planet. These little connections we need to start making. We have to start seeing these and anticipating them, not trying to react to them after the fact. So let me just look at one issue. I'd like to talk about why things aren't going to be the same in the future as they are today. I want to take a step back and mention one more thing about water. Water and carbon. Water is the next carbon. Water is linked to carbon. One way to begin to put a price on water is to get a price on carbon. What do I mean by that? 21% of all the energy used in California is used to move water. If you put a price on carbon, then you put a price on moving water, and at least water has some kind of a price. But if you can look at this chart, what you see is that the average amount of raw materials that it takes to make these common products on the left, a cotton t-shirt, a liter of Coke, a Kraft single, 1 ounce of cheese, a double quarter pounder, any of those, if you look at how much raw material from the farmer it took to make that item, you look at how much water it took, and there's always a range because some of it's irrigated, some of it's rain-fed, some of it's different varieties, different places. And then you look at what the farmer was paid for that amount of raw material. If you divide what they're paid by the amount of water they used, there isn't enough to pay a decent price for water, much less all the other costs that they had in production. And this isn't made up. These are all actual data, all prices farmers were really paid, etc. This is the kind of living embodiment, if you will, of what an environmental externality is. This is a cost, a price that is not brought into the price of a commodity. This is something that we need to begin to bring back into the cost, because living on a planet sustainably means covering the true cost of production, whether it's soil and soil erosion, whether it's habitat loss, whether it's water, whether it's biodiversity loss, etc. Some of these things will be easier to pay for than others. And it's not just about terrestrial. It's also about marine fisheries. If you look at global take in fisheries, we've pretty much kept it stable for the last 20 years. But if you look at this data, it shows that we've done that at the expense of basically overexploiting more and more resources and leaving the number of fisheries that are underexploited shrinking. There are some scientists that suggest that by 2048, we won't have any underexploited fisheries on the planet. They will all be overexploited by that point. We are producing twice as much fish from the same amount of tonnage of fish because we've gotten much better at processing the carcasses and taking meat off the bones, literally. But even that has not kept up with global consumption, and that's why the aquaculture industry has, in fact, moved forward very quickly. 30 years ago, most Americans had never heard of aquaculture. Today, aquaculture produces half of the seafood consumed by people on this planet. Half. Think about it. Aquaculture is the future of seafood in the same way that agriculture was the future of hunting and gathering. When we start putting a carbon price tag on fishing, aquaculture is going to look more interesting still because we have bigger boats chasing fewer fish over longer distances, which means there's more carbon per kilo of fish that we're harvesting. And this isn't a global trend. This is mostly a developing country trend. The big impacts in terms of aquaculture production and the big increases in production are in developing countries, in the blue here on this slide. There are some animal protein analysts that predict that whitefish, that ubiquitous kind of non-species specific category, whether it's wild-caught whitefish, but in this case aquaculture whitefish, will equal poultry by 2050 in terms of its importance as a protein source. And after 2050, aquaculture will take over because you can produce twice as much animal protein with the same amount of inputs. Because fish swim, they don't walk. And it's a lot less energy to swim than it is to walk. So it's a very basic thing. We can never make poultry as efficient as tilapia or catfish or pangasius from Vietnam. But I just want to point out one other thing here because this is a big issue moving forward. It's not always just a question of do we have enough production, it's a question of what the distribution here. 80% of the seafood that's produced on the planet today is produced in the South, in developing countries. But most of the seafood that's consumed today is consumed in the North, in the developed countries that can afford to buy the product. So we have a net protein drain from developing countries to developed countries. Again, it's not just about population, it's about consumption. And it's about who can afford to buy what. But these kind of flows are going to exacerbate some of the food issues that we have if we're going to feed this planet by 2050. So if you think about it, with water being left as an externality, with carbon and soil erosion being left as an externality, it's fairly clear that there is a cost to food that is too cheap. In America, we pay about 8% of our income on average for the food that we eat. In Europe, it's about 12. In the rest of the world, it's about 18. We would argue that this isn't a sustainable long-term approach. Food has got to cost more. The problem with that is 1 billion people today can't afford to buy food at the prices that it is today. In fact, for that 1 billion people, they can spend up to 70% of their income and still not get enough calories. Leave nutrition aside, they can't get enough calories every day. So as we move forward, we're going to have to de-link food production and poverty alleviation. We've got to figure out how to produce more food, and we've got to figure out how to produce more job and more capacity and more education for people to have a different life than simply maintaining poverty on farms. So the average company has control of probably far less than 15% of the embedded impacts that are in the products that they sell. What that means is, if you look at Walmart, they estimate that for all the carbon and greenhouse gases embedded in their products, They control in their processing, distribution, etc., their stores, 8% of the greenhouse gases. Unilever estimates that they actually control about 2% of the greenhouse gases embedded in the products that they make. Things like Skippy peanut butter, Ragu, toothpaste, etc. These are Unilever products that you may or may not be aware of. What that means is that most of the control of these embedded impacts are not under the control of companies, but the responsibility is increasingly being laid at the feet of these same companies. And that's why they're beginning to look at how do they work upstream with the raw material suppliers, the people that grow the materials that go into their products, and downstream with the consumers. Because the impacts can be either place. The biggest carbon impact of cotton is not growing cotton, even with all the pumping of irrigated water and the use of pesticides that are energy intensive to produce. 70% of the energy embedded in cotton is when a consumer washes and dries it 25 times and irons it. That's 70% of the energy. If you put a 10% nylon or rayon blend in with that cotton, you can cut the amount of time it takes to dry it and eliminate the amount of time it takes to iron it. If you use cold water detergent, you can also cut the amount of carbon that it takes to heat the water, which is what the embedded energy is. So companies are getting smarter about this. And they are going to have to start leading the way because, in fact, consumers take this statistic just floored me when I first read it. The average consumer takes 1.8 seconds to make a choice in the United States in a grocery store. In a restaurant, it takes about 5 to 10 seconds to make a choice. You can't select a product based on environmental criteria, based on science, in 1.8 seconds. There is no chance in hell that that's going to happen. So what we have to make sure is that all the products on the shelf are more sustainable. That is going to be the way forward. So all I've been talking about is actually up to this point in time. But we're not going to stay at this point in time. And if we want to solve what's coming in the future, we need to be looking out the windshield, not driving by looking at the rearview mirror in terms of the data that's coming from behind us. So we're going to have 3 billion more people on the planet. 70% of them are going to be living in cities. Incidentally, that's as many people living in cities in 2050 as are alive today on the planet. And all of them are going to need food. And none of them are really going to produce their basic calories. They may grow a few vegetables, they may have a few fruit trees, they may affect their nutrition, but they're not going to affect the calories that they need. That's going to come from someplace else. Income is going to increase by 2.8 times. In fact, income is going to rise in the next 50 years much faster than it did in the last 50 years. And much of that increased income for poor people is going to be spent on upgrading the food that they eat, especially animal protein. They're going to eat up the food chain. Consumption is going to double. In fact, that's probably a conservative estimate in terms of food. The calories that people may actually eat could well triple in terms of the calories they eat directly, the calories they eat that have been consumed by animals to produce other protein. This is the job before us. So clearly, there's not a silver bullet here. There's not one solution that's going to solve this problem. As we tell the people that we work with, it's not what to think, it's how to think. Because you've got to learn how to solve today's problem and tomorrow's and the day after. Because sustainability is a journey, not a destination. It's going to take us our whole lifetimes working on this to get better. We're never going to get to best. So we got to start connecting the dots. This is one of the first charts I put together in the early 2000s, and it looked at the relationship between soy production and pork consumption in China. And if you doubt that there's a relationship, just look at this data. China has more pigs than the rest of the planet put together. And pork is the preferred protein. They can't produce enough soy themselves, so they turn to Brazil. This was a rainforest 10 years ago. This, incidentally, is non-GM soy. In fact, most of the soy expansion in the Amazon and the Cerrado in Brazil is non-GM soy. There's a direct relationship between the demand for non-GM soy and deforestation in places like Brazil. These issues are more complicated than they appear on the surface. So China's importing soy and cotton and sugar from Brazil, but what it's actually buying is water and soil, which China doesn't have. China has a quarter the amount of water on average per capita as the rest of the countries on the planet. It has less than a quarter, about a tenth as much arable land per capita as places like the United States do. But what you see here is 2.4 crops per year, because this soy is being harvested, and right behind it are planters going in and planting the next crop. I used this photo in Brazil to talk about this issue, and the soy industry came up to me and said, but that's unfair because that was a staged photo. We did that for a calendar to show, what Brazil is really doing. And I said, is that staged soybeans? Or is that actually a field of soybeans? This is reality. You go into Mato Grosso, this is what it looks like. And it's amazing how that landscape has changed in such a little amount of time. And yet, today, two things are interesting that have happened in 2009. In the first quarter, I heard in May an interesting little tidbit from a Chinese guy attending a soy meeting in Brazil, and he was saying that the imports of soy into China during the first quarter of this year, 2009, were 30% higher than the first quarter of 2008. Now imagine what that means. That's 3 quarters into a global recession, and China is buying more soy. Because once people start eating meat, they keep eating meat. And that's one of the little lessons. But this year also, 2009, the data for deforestation in Brazil shows the lowest deforestation rates of any period that we have data for. And that's because farmers in Brazil are waiting to find out what the price for carbon is going to be, and if it doesn't make more sense to grow carbon than soy. That's what it's all about, what happens in Copenhagen. And people are waiting to see, and they're holding back. This is the new world we live in, bringing carbon into competitive pricing with other commodities. So if you manage what you measure, it's pretty clear that you can't measure everything, so you've got to figure out what you need to begin to measure. And I want to walk you through just some counterintuitive examples to show that this isn't quite as obvious or as straightforward as people think. How many of you have had one of these in the last week? Any way, shape, or form? Okay. So we could talk about this product from how much carbon is embedded in it. We could talk about it from how many minutes of labor all the way through the supply chain it took to deliver it. We could talk about how much poverty was alleviated during the growing of this. But I want to talk about just one thing, and that's water. I want to talk about how much water it took to put this in your hand. So there's water that is to make the coffee. There's water to grow the coffee, to produce the sugar, the milk, the paper, and the plastic lid. Turns out it takes a lot more water to make a grande latte than anybody ever knew. It takes about this much water in the bottom of the cup to make the espresso, the single or double shot. Not very much. In fact, I've been doing some work with Starbucks. They use more water to wash the spoons to keep them clean than they use to make the coffee. Their customers use more water to flush the toilets than they use to make the coffee. In fact, Starbucks sells almost as much milk as it does coffee, if truth be told. There's about 2.5 liters of water that it takes to make every plastic lid. The cup and sleeve are about 5.5 liters of water to make the paper that goes into those cups and sleeves. The sugar, if you use sugar, on average, it takes about 7.5 liters to grow the sugar that goes into a latte. A latte is mostly milk, and it takes about almost 50 liters of water to produce the milk that goes into one latte. Now, it's not just to produce the milk, but it's to maintain the cow in order to produce the milk. So it's a life cycle assessment. All of these are. And then coffee itself is the big winner. This is a tree. It takes a lot of water out of the ground. Now, not all of this water is that important. Some of it's green water, some of it's blue water, some of it's rain, some of it's pumped from underground. But the point is, this is how much water it takes to make one grande latte. That's about 50 gallons. Who'da thunk it? And it's not just this, although I'm convincing Starbucks that they need to add in each one of their shops around the world a chart that shows how they're doing on water, how they've reduced it since last year, to use this as a consumer education tool. Again, World Wildlife Fund in its entire history has spent less money on conservation in 50 years than Coke spends on 1 year in advertising. We need to get these kind of companies to begin to educate consumers about our issues, about issues that affect us all, and water is certainly one of them. There's been another issue about whether you should buy local or not as a way to reduce carbon. This was published in Conservation. It's a peer-reviewed journal that looks at mostly conservation issues globally, and they looked at 8 different food categories, and the red on your left is what the carbon is that's embedded in the transportation of the product. The yellow in the middle is the carbon that's associated with how that product is produced wherever it's grown. And what you see is that about 90% of the carbon is in how it's produced. So if you really want to affect how the carbon is in food, you need to affect how it's grown. How it's transported is kind of icing on the cake. And in fact, this leads you to some interesting conclusions. Lamb that's produced in New Zealand and frozen and shipped to England has less carbon in it than lamb that's produced in England. Because in England you have to produce hay and you have to have heated barns to keep the animals in the winter, etc. In New Zealand's an ideal place to produce lamb. These issues are not quite as simple as they appear on the surface. But if we're going to be science-based, if we're going to actually reduce these impacts, we've got to know what they really are. And again, the science is changing. You know, this is the science from now. In 10 to 20 years, I guarantee this chart won't look exactly like this because our science will get better. But as long as we're directionally going in the right direction, we can live with that. We can't wait for the perfect, but we don't want to be headed in the wrong direction either. So how are we going to freeze the footprint of food by 2050? We've identified 7 ways here that we think are going to contribute. We call them kind of food wedges. We've stolen this from the Princeton boys who look at how we're going to get off of petroleum and into renewable energy. There's not a single solution here. But one thing that's very clear, if we're going to triple the number of calories by 2050, we're going to have to do it in a lot of different ways because no single way is going to triple food calories available to people. And genetics has got to be part of it. We have never increased food production without increases in plant breeding, in breeding programs in general, and we can't take that off the table. Whether it's land races, traditional plant breeding, whether it's hybrids, whether it's genetic engineering, cisgenics, or even GMOs, we've got to look at this issue, and we've got to use science to figure out how we move forward on this. Is the GM threat of soy globally more of an issue than deforestation to buy non-GM soy? We got to start asking ourselves questions like this. And reasonable people are going to disagree about it, but let's at least have the discussion around science, not about assumptions and not around ideology. And genetics is only one piece of this. At most, it will give us 25% of what we need. We need to improve management practices. The best producers on the planet are 100 times better than the worst for every crop. The best countries, on average, are 10 times better than the worst countries, on average, to produce any single crop. We've got to figure out how to shift the bottom of the curve. That's going to be more important than trying to shift the top. We've got to look at technology. How do we apply inputs? How can we do it more effectively? How do we use less tillage? How do we improve harvesting? How do we reduce waste? How do we improve irrigation? 70% of all the water used on the planet is used for agriculture, and half of it's wasted. So how can we get that better? How can we get, as they say, more crop per drop? That's the kind of efficiency that new technologies can give us. But we've also got to improve how much production we get off land we've already used. In some cases, we've already abandoned. Bringing land back into production is much better, much more cost-effective, and much better planetary impact than cutting down or forest or converting grasslands into croplands. We've got to get property rights right. And I'm not just talking about IP and genetics and companies like that. I'm also talking about land rights for farmers. In Africa, most farmers don't own their land. Are they going to be inclined to plant a tree, to invest in an agricultural terrace, to do anything that requires a long-term payback if somebody can come and take the land from them? Land rights is going to be a chunk of whatever the solution is. And then we've got to deal with waste. Up to 40% of production, all the water, all the inputs, all the labor, all the time, everything that was put into a crop in many developing countries is lost after it's harvested, post-harvest losses. It's not just in developing countries. In developed countries too, as much as 40% of food is wasted after the retail or at the retail shop, at the restaurant, at the home. How many times have you thrown food away from your refrigerator? If we had a simple handheld device that could tell you whether food has E. coli, salmonella, aflatoxin, or anything that's going to hurt you, we could save billions of dollars and save a lot of food. It wouldn't even cost $100 for one of these things, just to get people to eat their leftovers. And then overconsumption. And it's not just overconsumption in terms of calories, it's overconsumption in terms of meat and animal proteins and those things that multiply the impact. So let's look at genetics and productivity. If we want to be strategic, let's not focus on 100 crops. Let's focus on the 8 crops that represent more than 80% of all the calories consumed on the planet. And this gives you an idea of which those 8 crops are. We can't afford to be working on little niche crops. We need to work on calories. And let's look at how we're doing with genetics. So if you look at the last 20 or 30 years, this is the amount of increased production that has happened per year in each of these crops. And actually, only sugar beets and cotton, which isn't, even though more than half the weight of cotton is cotton seed, which is edible, is not considered a food crop. Only really sugar beets, sugar cane, and palm oil are going to double in their calories by 2050 on average, given the current trends. Nothing else will. So we need to reinvest in this. But we also have to match our investments in terms of where the need is. The greatest increase in population, the greatest increase in demand for food is going to be in the tropics and developing countries. Those crops are not temperate crops. Those crops are cassava, cocoa yams, plantains and bananas, peanuts, sorghum, millet, other crops. None of the major companies that do work on plant genetics are working on those crops because today there's not a commercial market. We need to find ways to free up the money to begin to work there. We need to find new strategies to allow companies to pool their resources the same way that oil and gas companies don't invest anymore in a single, in a well by themselves or a field by themselves. They go in groups of 4 and 5 to reduce their risk, because 20% of something is a lot better than 100% of nothing. And likewise, we can take that same strategy to pool resources, to look at these crops that are important in the tropics: sorghum, millet, peanuts, etc., cassava. We've got to find ways to reduce risk, ways that work in the marketplace. We need to reduce waste. In 1970, the whitefish from the North Atlantic, the pollock, etc., we were harvesting about 35% of the weight of the fish as fillets, and the rest we threw away. Today it's a different story. Today we capture usually more than 70% of the weight of the fish and turn it into edible protein. That's what surimi is made from. That's what the fake crab legs are made from, etc. It's what used to be thrown away, and now we're harvesting it. But we're not just harvesting the fish, we're also using all the carcasses and the rest of it to grind up and make it into fish meal and fish oil to feed other animals to produce more protein with that as well. Literally every single bit is being used. We need to do that in every possible opportunity, in every way, if we're going to meet this global demand that's coming. We need to also improve the efficiency of production. You can see what's happened with poultry, which is kind of the poster child of protein for the last 40 years. The way that the companies that have produced poultry have been managing themselves, measuring their impacts, is around feed conversion, mortality, the age at the time it goes to market, and the average weight. And they've been improving phenomenally. In fact, we've set new targets for Brazil, which is the world's leading poultry producer in terms of exports. And the target for feed is 1.4, not 1.8. But that's going to be just about the limits of how far that industry can grow. And each of these others improving. But the interesting thing is what's not on this list. Because as science gets better, we know what kinds of questions to answer, or to ask, and hopefully find the answers. How much antibiotics is in this chicken? How much growth hormones are in this chicken? How much fish is in this chicken? In the source of fish meal and fish oil, there's some in every animal that you eat and every egg that you eat. You didn't know that buying poultry is actually helping to deplete the ocean's resources, but it is. How much water, much more basic, how much water is in this chicken? We know it takes about 32 liters of water to produce one chicken. We think we can do that with about 16, and we've got companies now that are beginning to reduce that water. But that's just on the grow out and the processing. If you throw in the soybeans and throw in the corn, then it's up to more than 2,000 liters of water to produce a chicken. But most chicken growers don't see that. They never calculate it. They don't manage it. But that's changing. Greenpeace started attacking Cargill and McDonald's in Europe, not because of feed not because of confined animal operations, not because of PETA-like issues, but because poultry production in Europe, produced by Cargill for sale in McDonald's, was leading to deforestation in the Amazon. People are connecting the dots. There's a lot more information out there. It's a lot easier to do than it used to be. Better practices. I mentioned that better farmers are 100 times better than the worst farmers. This shows in the US cattle ranches less than a mile apart. The photos were taken within an hour of each other on the same day. Everything is exactly the same here except for how the land is managed. And this is what we need to begin to learn about and spread and encourage what's on the right and discourage what's on the left. Our estimates show that we've probably easily got somewhere between 150 and 250 million hectares of land that can be brought back into production, that has been farmed, degraded, and either abandoned entirely or used for very low productivity pasture. This will give us a huge chunk of what we need to feed the planet. In fact, we've looked at how you can rehabilitate degraded land and bring it back into soy production in the Amazon or palm oil production in Southeast Asia. And in both places, what we found is that the cheapest way to farm and the cheapest from an internal rate of return and a net present value calculation is to buy degraded land and rehabilitate it. Farmers in Brazil make more money growing the soil than they do growing soybeans. And they do that because they buy land at 15 cents on the dollar, and every year they double its value. And at the end of 5 years, they can use that land as collateral to buy more. And this is how companies are beginning to leapfrog this. And this is beginning now to happen in Borneo and other parts of palm oil producing areas in Indonesia. But what this shows is that both for soy and for palm oil is that we could increase production. In fact, we think we could probably double it over the next 20 years or so without cutting a single tree. And that's the type of thing that we need. We're also trying to figure out how we can bring these environmental values into the pricing of commodities. Most people don't really kind of understand commodities, but commodities were invented by the private sector, and they were invented to solve a very specific problem. You needed to have raw materials that were substitutable for each other equally, sight unseen, where you could buy sugar from one part of the world and use it in a factory, and buy sugar from another part of the world and use it in a factory, and not have to change any formulations or any cleaning or screening or whatever. So it was used to basically make production more efficient. In fact, it's no accident that this kind of interchangeability of the sources of commodities came right on the heels of the Industrial Revolution and the interchangeable parts. It happened about 20 years later, in fact. Prior to 1850 or so, every bag of wheat was kept in the bag that it came out of the farm on. It was never consolidated into big units and shipped by train and all that stuff. That all changed as a result of creating commodities. And initially, all of these standards focused on physical attributes. How much moisture was there? What is the weight? What was the color, the quality, the foreign matter? Were there rocks in it? How much was allowable? Were there chipped or broken seeds? How much was allowable? What were the health and safety issues? And all of those got better as the science got better at detection. And let me just make one more point here. The private sector invented this. It took government 40 to 80 years to pass regulations about it. So number 2 yellow corn wasn't defined by law in the US in terms of what yellow meant until 1966. Cotton in the US wasn't defined as white, what white was, until 1930. We've been producing cotton for 300 years. So it's very interesting the role that government plays after the fact in coming in. Now the private sector has started creating trading systems to bring intangible values to the market. Organic. You can't tell by looking at a product whether it's organic or not, so you need a system of segregation to determine that. Non-GM, poverty alleviation, fair trade, no child labor, all these things are being done. Why can't we begin to bring carbon into commodity pricing? We did a little study for Mars that showed that they want to be carbon neutral as a company. That means they want to reduce their energy use by about 35% through efficiency and building new plants that are more efficient and all these kinds of things. But they're still going to have about 1.4 million tons of carbon a year that they cannot get away from because it takes carbon to make products. And so they want to not buy this through Chicago or through some kind of impersonal cap and trade system that is half a world away that they never see. They want to use the purchase of carbon to align their producers of cocoa or sugar or milk back to the company and pay the farmers for carbon in addition to the commodity they're buying. The calculation that we did showed that if they bought less than 1 ton of carbon per hectare for all the hectares that are used to grow their cocoa, they could offset their entire carbon as a company, and it would represent 0.05% increase in the price they paid for the raw material. So this is doable. It's manageable. It's not a huge issue. We can kind of find solutions on this, and some of them are going to be new and different. So I worked in Ethiopia on a famine and doing research on the famine, as I mentioned earlier, and I was interviewing a guy, a farmer. Turns out most refugees are farmers, and actually that could be portending what's going to be in the future with climate change and things. I asked him why it was that the world didn't realize that famines are in fact made by people, not nature. And he said they don't want to see it. In fact, we have a saying in Ethiopia that goes something like this: you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. So what I would ask of all of you is that we wake up to the fact that we live on one planet. It's all of ours to manage, and each of us can do something about that. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions.
Yes?
Well, just curiosity, you had slides up for different species of fish and how much is aquaculture and how much is captured. What's that like for shrimp?
So in terms of shrimp, global shrimp production is about, this will be roughly correct. Global production is about 25% from aquaculture, but global trade is about half from aquaculture. So what is produced in a lot of developing countries is consumed there as dried shrimp, brine shrimp, things, but what is traded internationally is about half from aquaculture at this point. It's probably the least of any of the major seafood items as a percentage of production. In the back here?
What is your definition of sustainability?
Oh, good. Nice question. I don't actually have one. I think sustainability is like a lot of other things that we live with, like democracy or love or whatever, that it is something that we know it when we see it, that it's a process rather than a final result. For me, it's about using less to make more. It's about having fewer impacts. I guess the way I would bring home the definition of sustainability is to say that it's about leaving the planet better for our children than we got it, and we're not doing very well on that front.
Jeff, it seems like part of the argument about purchasing locally and producing locally is to live with the impacts of your consumption. And so a lot of the increasing consumption in other places, increasing productivity in other parts of the world, doesn't that actually promote poverty in those countries? Because in fact, the small farmers are being pushed off the land to produce these larger commodities.
I think the issue of trade and poverty and commodities and buying local is all intertwined. Absolutely, no question about it. But I would argue that most small farmers are actually finding it harder to make a living because the economies of scale are working against them. And as inheritance and distribution of land reduces their productive assets with each generation, it becomes harder and harder. So the farms that are the most viable are the ones that can build up either through size or through collaboration with other farmers to create co-ops or other larger units. But if you have 5 hectares of land and 4 kids, and then each of those kids has 1.25 hectares of land in the next generation, it's going to be very hard to make a living on that regardless of what people are doing in other parts of agriculture. There are just some real issues that we're fighting here that are hard. I think the biggest one is that agriculture has been a kind of a pressure valve for governments to simply ignore, to allow poor people to live on farms and to stay there, but not provide them with any assets or resources to have a better way of life, whether it's farming or beginning to process farm goods or even moving into other types of jobs. Governments have kind of ignored, if you will, these small farmers, and that's why there are many of us that are beginning to take a hard look at some of the certification and eco-label programs that serve a function really of maintaining poverty rather than helping to alleviate it. I heard a quote by a guy from Mars, and Mars is interesting because they're privately held, so they can do things that a lot of publicly held companies can't because it depends on what the family is interested in. But they've made a commitment to buy all of their cocoa as certified by third parties being sustainable by 2020. That's 17% of the global cocoa market. Mars has said they will not buy certified poverty. And if they're going to buy from farmers, they want to make sure that they're getting a livable wage and that they're in a system that provides a future for their kids. That's a different attitude than many companies have, and that's the kind of attitude that we don't yet know how that's going to be implemented, and they don't know how they're going to buy 100% of all their cocoa being certified. But that's the kind of vision that allows people to come along afterwards and help make it happen, help make it into a reality. And let's say they only get to 90% by 2020. Well, that's not bad. It's better to have an audacious goal that you almost make than a very limited or no goal that you clearly make. In the way back.
How do you foresee peak oil affecting this threat for triple agricultural production at 2050?
Actually, I think it's going to help. One of the things about peak oil is that it means everything's more expensive. And with everything more expensive, it means farmers are willing to waste less. Efficiency is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Pollution is basically a sign of inefficiency. So I think actually peak oil is going to force us to make changes about how food is produced and consumed and get back to issues. Is buying local better? And in some cases it will be, but in others it won't. And if we're managing the planet efficiently and kind of rationally, then comparative advantage is real. And some places are better at producing some things than others, but others are better at producing other things. And trade is part of how you manage a planet efficiency. So, I think that peak oil scares me less than peak water. Peak water is scary. Peak soil is really scary. Because if we have passed the Rubicon of soil, and there's a lot of indicators that we may have, that's a much more scary issue. There's a lot of hands here. I don't care. No, not in the back. You're in the front.
Do you think bottled water is a huge issue?
Look, I think having bottled water available probably makes sense. Has it gotten out of hand? Yes. When we're shipping water from Fiji to the U.S., that's dumb. That is really dumb. But having water available when you get through the security lines and want water on an airplane, having water available when your kid's on the playground and we know that the biggest source of germs on the playground is the water fountain. There are things that that we're never going to get away from needing water in bottles, and we're not always going to remember to bring it. So having water available in bottles, I have no problem with. I have problems with shipping it. I have problems with shipping it around. And I think a smarter business model, if I were God, would be that all the companies that make bottled water do it as joint venture partnerships with local municipalities, so that those water systems actually make part of the profits too, and it's invested in better water for everybody, rather than having it only going into the private sector. In the US, we have an aging water distribution system. That's a little bit of an issue. In developing countries, this is a huge issue. If Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Nestle invested in local water systems and had bottled water, I don't think people would have nearly as much of a problem with it as they do today. In the back. Yeah.
Well, I was curious about the use of this term carbon, because are we talking about using gasoline or releasing carbon into the air? I do not hear so much about it.
Sure. So when I use the term carbon, I'm actually referring to the equivalent of greenhouse gases that cause or contribute to climate change. So it would include nitrous oxide, it would include methane, it would include carbon dioxide, all those things. We tend to lump that together and convert it all into carbon. And that's what most people who are talking about this kind of thing use that shorthand. But in fact, nitrous oxide is a couple hundred times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Methane's about 24 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. But we have to have, and just to make it even more complicated, there's 4 tons of carbon dioxide to create 1 ton of carbon. So it's sorry, but that's why these shorthands arise. It sounds like gobbledygook, I'm sure. Let's try this side in the back.
It seems like most of the things that you say need to happen either need to be motivated by consumers or by government, which ultimately should be motivated by the will of the constituents. How do you think that, how well do you think this information is being disseminated to the public in order to inform consumer decisions, and how do you think that
So, what's the role of consumers and the role of government, and how do you inform and kickstart both of them? Well, I guess I would say that if I had to bet on a horse in this race, I'd bet on the private sector. I don't think consumers actually are informed enough to make informed choices, and I don't think they're motivated enough to actually do what they say they will do. I mean, I helped set up a trading company to buy and sell products out of the rainforest a long time ago, and consumers always said that they would buy this stuff, but if it cost more, they just didn't. And I think we've got to think about that issue. I know that regulation is absolutely essential. I know that it is absolutely the cornerstone of helping to move things along. But we can't get governments to even agree to sit to the table to talk about a lot of issues that need to be solved today, not 50 years from now. The way that the commodity stuff, as I described it, governments manage, at best, their own territories. At worst, they don't even manage those, but no government manages the planet. And we have to start looking at who has the vested interest in the long term of keeping this planet going. It's not necessarily countries that are competing with each other. So I think, yes, we do need regulations, but I think private voluntary standards that help push industry then allow governments to come up and do regulation that's much higher than it would be otherwise. The two clearly work in tandem, but until we can say that these are the 6 or 8 things government focuses on, there would be a threat that we focus on 100 things and do nothing, because you can't focus on 100 things. You simply can't. We can't focus on 2 things as a country. We can't do healthcare and climate change and 2 wars at the same time. I mean, it's just not possible. So I think we need to be thoughtful about where this change is going to come from. Everybody has a role, but not all the roles are equal. And consumers and informed consumption and informed consumers can make a difference, absolutely. And it can make a difference because it's not only it's an example, but I was talking to a person from a company who said if they get 10 letters from individuals that are on the same topic but written independently, they will act. If they get 1,000 postcards that are all from Greenpeace, they won't act. Because it's a form thing. Somebody just sent it in. It's not something that they're actually thinking. But if they get clearly independent confirmation that people care about an issue, they will take note of it, and they will begin to move.